Okay, now we're in shape. My name is Tim Watt. I am the chair of Oregon Masters Swimming. My co-host with me tonight is Bob Bruce, the OMS long distance chair and open water committee member of Oregon Masters Swimming. Tonight we have Dr. Kirsten Lorentzen. She's a functional medicine practitioner in Oregon. Her doctorate is in chiropractic and she holds a master's in human nutrition and functional medicine. Dr. K specializes in working with athletes to prevent nutrient deficiencies so that they can optimize their performance, longevity in their sport, reduce the risk of injury, and promote a healthy body. Kirsten swims with US Masters Swimming and trains with the Oregon City Tankers, has completed an Ironman competition. She will be our presenter this evening, and at this time, I'm going to make you the host.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Happy to have you. So, Kirsten, I'm going to let you take over as soon as I can find you
Cool.
here.
Yeah. Let's see. Yep.
You're now the host.
Okay, cool. Let me see if I can yeah, perfect. We'll get this open here and then we'll jump in. Okay. I'm gonna move this over just a little. Fabulous. Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. The GI tract is something that I didn't know I would work with when I went out and started to become a chiropractor. But as I have learned a lot about the health of the human body, but also as I start working more with athletes and as I've worked through my own journey with my health, there's been so much that I've learned about the gut. So we're going to dive in. I'm gonna have to click, I think. Okay, so as Tim already mentioned, I originally started out with my Doctor of Chiropractic, and then in the middle of that degree, I got my master's in human nutrition and functional medicine. And part of what led me there was that I was dealing with a lot of different things going on in my gut. My story is that I had endometriosis. It was diagnosed as a teenager. And then I went on birth control, and I also went on a lot of antibiotics to try to heal up my skin and to try to, because I had acne, and things like that. And at the time I had used all the different types of topicals. And so they put me on this low grade antibiotic, which I was on for a very long time for antibiotic use when I was a teenager. And then after that, so many things started happening. I started getting I couldn't eat because it was so painful to eat I lost a lot of weight when I went to college. I also ended up getting migraines at that point, and then those plagued me throughout the rest of my time in college. And it's been through this process of just learning more about the GI tract and learning how all of these different pieces interact with our body that has led me to functional medicine and now what I do. And what's really cool and what you're going to see in the rest of this presentation is not just how the GI tract falls apart in many ways and causes a lot of symptoms, but also how we can use GI health to help promote performance as well. Because one of the things that I see all the time, especially working with athletes, is that we focus a lot on that performance aspect, but then we sort of seem to drop the health piece. And at a certain point, what you'll see is athletes just kind of start to break down. And what we want to do is to try to prevent that as much as possible so they can continue to perform at their optimal level. Okay, so let's move on here. Just a couple of logistics. This is being recorded, so you will be able to get the replay. And then if you have questions, please ask them. I can't see the chat right now, but I will leave time to ask a Q&A at the end. And I am going to make a very solid effort to be done talking in 40 to 45 minutes so that there is time to ask questions. So here we go. So what are we going to cover today? So first off, a question I get asked a lot is, what is the microbiome? A lot of people have heard about the GI tract and the microbiome and bacteria and all of the things that is a part of what's coming out more in research, but they don't actually really know what that is. So we're going to talk about that today. And we're also going to talk about how it relates to your performance in sport. We are also going to talk about 4 keystone bacteria that you absolutely want to make sure are present in the gut, because they basically create an opportunity for the rest of these different types of bacteria to be there. There's one bacteria in particular that can influence your weight and cravings for simple sugars, which is an interesting one. And we will talk about that, and also how it relates to endurance sports. We will also talk a little bit about how endurance sports and also ultra distance events like Ironmans and triathlons and ultra running. We will talk a little bit about that, but that also translates into your long distance swimming as well. So we'll talk a bit about how that can have both a negative and a positive impact on your gut, and then what you can do to make sure you have a healthy gut. We'll also talk about some common causes of gut complaints and concerns in athletes, and then how working with your gut can improve both recovery, boost performance, and keep athletes in their sport for longer. Cool. All right, so your digestive system, it starts from the mouth and goes all the way to the large intestine. So your mouth is where everything starts. And there's a reason why it is built the way it is. And part of it is, and we don't always think about this, but it literally inside of us, but in the GI tract, is actually open to the outside world. So what you'll see as a pattern as we go throughout the rest of this webinar is that our body has a lot of stuff built into our gut to help protect us from the outside world and from pathogens and all sorts of things that come through the GI tract. But sometimes that can work against us when there's some other things going on with the gut. So those are some things that we'll talk about today. One critical thing to keep in mind is that your mouth is the only mechanical digestive piece that we have. So chewing is a really important process when it comes to breaking down your food and helping your body be able to digest food well. And also saliva starts that digestive process as well, but that food goes to the stomach, and then it's as that stomach has acid in it, which helps to break a lot of that food down, and that is the start of the chemical process to digest food. And then when your stomach reaches a certain acidity, then it will drop that food into the large small intestine, and that's when the pancreas and the gallbladder will continue to release a couple of things called bile and also some more digestive enzymes to help the small intestine be able to absorb our food and break it down further. The small intestine is where a large part of our absorption of nutrients comes from. So that's not just your proteins, so all of your macros like proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, but that's also things like your micronutrients as well, like your vitamins and minerals, stuff like that. That's where the majority of that happens. As the food passes from the small intestine into the large intestine, now this is where that bacteria is supposed to be. So this is where your microbiome of your gut is. The bacteria more or less live in that large intestine, and they do a couple of things. The last job of the large intestine is to absorb a little bit more water back into the body. The small and large intestine also play a role in detoxification. The liver will drop stuff into the small and large intestine that it wants to remove from the body. So that does play a role in that. And the large intestine also, because of that bacteria, does do a little bit more of some absorption of different types of vitamins like vitamin K, because the majority of the vitamin K that we actually get is from the bacteria breaking down the food that we eat, and then they produce vitamin K and then we get to absorb them. So it's a very interesting process. But one of the things that's so interesting about bacteria is that we basically give the bacteria a home, and in exchange, they do a lot of things for us. As I mentioned, they help us digest food, they make certain vitamins, and they also can help us with our immune defense as well. The microbiome also acts as a barrier to help your body be able to filter and appropriately absorb nutrients. And so that's a very critical piece to remember, because as we have imbalances with the different types of bacteria in the gut, and as they change, those can have certain implications for how we process food, for how we absorb sugars, and for our metabolic health and hormone health, and a lot of other things. So, okay. So your microbiome, as far as we know so far, there's 500 species that usually are in the GI tract, and that's up to around 100 trillion bugs altogether. They actually say that the genetic components of humans in and of themselves is quite small in comparison to the genetic material of the bacteria that live in our gut. So as we've been looking and studying more about the GI tract, we're finding that the bacteria in some ways can actually there are some studies where they're looking at athletes and they're trying to learn from athletes so that they can apply this more to general population. But one of the things that they're looking at is if different types of bacteria in different levels and high amounts of bacteria leads to higher performance. And there are some studies, though minimal, that are suggesting that there may be something there. But the whole idea of it is that the bacteria themselves have a tendency to, like, they do influence a lot of what we do. Whether that's because we're able to absorb food better, or some of those, the food that we eat, maybe that's a piece of it. They're not entirely sure, but there's a lot more to be learned there. And your microbiome doesn't only mean your GI tract. It's not just there. You actually have a lot of bacteria all over the body. And that's actually very important to know, because one of the things when we talk about different ways where you can help to build up your microbiome is you'll hear a lot of people say, spend time outside. Like, I think every single gut class I've taken that has taught me more about the GI tract, they've mentioned get outside, and they've mentioned like get dirty, like get your hands in the soil, like walk in the dirt and like get your hands dirty. And it's a very interesting concept because you're basically getting a lot of different types of bacteria on your hands, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it gets into your gut. But what we've found is that you have bacteria all over your skin. You have your own like oral bacteria. There's bacteria everywhere. And what they do is when you get some of that soil and that dirt on your hands, or you spend time outside, it contributes to that overall microbiome. And then that can contribute to GI tract health in different ways. So it's not just your gut. There's bacteria everywhere, and they actually can be a very good thing. Okay, so the 4 keystone bacteria that you really want to make sure are there, and I did make sure to put this into perspective for our athletes. So, and there is a reference at the bottom that you can go, and that's where a lot of this came from. So so probiotics and prebiotics, so probiotics in particular in bacteria are a very interesting thing. People tend to get a little bit confused as far as where we can get probiotics from, because you can actually get quite a bit of bacteria from eating just regular food. So fermented food, cultured foods. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end, as far as like, what are some different things that you can do to try to improve your GI tract health. But one of those is not just taking probiotics. We're also going to talk a little bit about when probiotics is not the right thing to do. So we'll get there. There are 2 types of keystone bacteria, the Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes bacteria. Basically, what they do is that this is like your bifidobacterium and your lactobacillus bacteria that you usually see in like yogurt, for example. Your Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes bacteria have a very big impact on how you absorb different types of foods. And actually, what's interesting with the Firmicutes bacteria is that, so these 2 you usually find in a ratio. And that ratio is really critical because it can have an impact on how you absorb different types of foods, and it can have an impact on your metabolic health. So what we found is when certain types of GI tracts have higher levels of Firmicutes bacteria, you actually absorb simple sugars better. And what we see is they're usually higher under stress and lead to cravings of a lot of those sugary type foods. Here's where this is so critical, especially for our endurance athletes. A lot of what we do is we fuel off of simple sugars. It's the best way to help you be able to perform well. But what we found, and you're actually going to see some studies coming up here soon, but what we found is that Firmicutes bacteria raise up when you get into those types of events. So let's say you're going out for one of those longer swims. What happens is the body actually increases those Firmicutes bacteria so that you can utilize that sugar a little bit better that you're bringing in from fueling. And then it also raises because of stress. So it's a very interesting thing, and it will start to drop back down. However, Where I see this start to become an issue is when the ratio doesn't correct itself. And then what happens is I have an athlete or a patient sitting in front of me that will say, I'm really struggling to lose weight. And they've tried all of the different things and nothing seems to be working. And we run a GI panel and we see that this ratio is off. And sometimes this is a really, really critical piece for being able to move that dial for them so that they can start to get back to a weight that they want to be. The lactobacillus bacteria is a very interesting bacteria. And the reason why this is May is because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're still learning so much about the different types of bacteria, but the lactobacillus can help to maintain overall health. They help to enhance immunity, helps with keeping that gut barrier strength and helping to lower oxidative stress from training. One of the things we will talk about later on in this webinar is how training in and of itself is an inflammatory thing that we do. It's actually really important to have inflammation after training. However, we do need to be able to manage that stress on the body and that inflammation. And so lactobacillus in some ways can help us do that. Bifidobacterium helps us break down food. It helps us absorb nutrients. It can help increase energy and also help with our immune system. And it also helps with maintaining that integrity of the gut lining, which is pretty critical. So if any of these are missing, which I do see often, and actually the Akkermansia one, I just saw today right before this, a patient of mine had low Akkermansia on her lab. But both of these, though, are critical to have, and it is common not to see as like the level that we would want to see. It's common to see them low, just simply because we don't tend to eat a whole lot of like cultured foods anymore, cultured and fermented foods. It's just something that doesn't show up as often in our diet. So, as well as also eating a wide variety of different types of foods too. So. The other thing, another keystone bacteria is the Akkermansia. And these are really important because they help with how we absorb glucose. So this is how the GI tract can influence our metabolism. The other thing is that they can influence energy production, lipid metabolism, and also help with intestinal immunity too. So the reason why we mention these is because as I said, and we'll see these come up here in a little bit, but the bacteria and these keystone bacteria basically create, if they are at the right levels, then they allow for all these other different types of bacteria to be there so that we raise up that gut diversity. And that helps a lot with our immune system, which is critical. Okay. So this is also where I get a lot of questions and also where I hear a lot of confusion around how to work with the GI tract. So probiotics and prebiotics are a little bit different. So probiotics are bacteria, which we can constantly bring into the body, but they do need food to keep them around. Prebiotics are basically fiber-rich foods that probiotics feed and grow on. So you have to have both of these things in order for in order for bacteria to stick around. But here is the thing, and I will say this over and over and over again. We have seen studies, many studies now, that probiotics don't stick around in the GI tract like you would think they do. They usually tend to like pass through the gut. They create more or less an anti-inflammatory environment. They help you digest food a bit, but they don't tend to just like what you would consider like re-inoculate the gut. They don't tend to necessarily stick around. What actually helps bacteria stick around is from food. So things like yogurt and kimchi and sauerkraut and like all of those different types of fermented foods, those and fermented veggies. I mean, that's not just sauerkraut, right? Like I have in my fridge right now, I have like a ginger, carrot, beet, like shredded, basically it's like sauerkraut. It's fermented veggies, right? But they're not sauerkraut. But those are all different types of ways to get more bacteria into the GI tract. And it's through food that they stick around. So that's key number one. But number two is if you have an inflammatory environment, like, so if the GI tract is inflamed, that bacteria isn't going to want to stick around. It's kind of like, here's a good example. So I don't know how many of you garden, but when you try to like grow roses or grow plants, if the environment, if the soil doesn't have very good food, then those plants don't usually grow very well. If the soil has fungi, if it has bacteria or pathogens, it's very often that, you know, those plants do not thrive, right? Well, it's the same idea here with the bacteria. If the environment itself doesn't have food to feed it, or if it doesn't have, or if it has, you know, a lot of inflammation, or if it has the presence of things that we don't want to be there, then those plants don't really like to stick around. The bacteria doesn't like to stick around. And so that's the same way that we want to look at the GI tract here. There's also some different types of fibers that those prebiotics have that also help in other ways with the body too, but we won't go into those today. So the idea here with all of this, and you'll see different types of probiotics with like 1 billion CFUs and 25 billion CFUs, and maybe you'll see some with 200 or 250 CFUs. The idea is to work with food, and that's the best thing. Now, when you need a probiotic, there's a reason for that, we will talk a little bit more about that later on. But the idea is to eat food, eat a large variety of that different type of food, and eat the rainbow, because remember this as well. This is another really great one that I tell my clients. So if you picture a bell pepper, does a green bell pepper and a red bell pepper, like, do you consider them necessarily like a different food? Most people look at green bell peppers and red bell peppers and orange bell peppers as sort of just a bell pepper, right? It's like the same thing, and you're going to cut them all up and you're going to put them in your food, but your bacteria sees them in a different way. So what makes a red bell pepper and an orange bell pepper different there are some changes in the different types of nutrients that are there, but it's the different fibers that make them different colors. And what happens is when those different fibers go into the GI tract, it requires different bacteria to help break down those fibers. So this is why it's so critical to be eating a wide variety of different types of foods and a wide different type of colors, because it eventually, over time, your body will build up the bacteria to be able to digest that food. So diversity, eat a lot of different types of foods. There's no shortage of food around here. So this is one of my favorite pictures as far as how to describe what's going on in the GI tract and what can go wrong. So this right here is your GI tract, and like the inside of it. This is your body. This is the bloodstream. This is the internal world. So as food passes through here, we can also get pathogens that pass through here. We can get all sorts of things. But if we have food pass through and it's inflammatory to the GI tract, if we have pathogens, if we have like E. coli or food poisoning or things like that, all of that can cause problems for the GI tract here. Over time of having too much inflammation, this mucosal layer can start to break down, which is very protective for the lining of the gut. And if we have too much inflammation, too much exposure to inflammatory foods, for some people, this isn't for everybody, but for some people, this lining can start to break down, and we start to see something that's called intestinal permeability or leaky gut. At first, leaky gut was a very controversial thing, but now we have seen so many different studies, and in just a little bit, you'll see a few studies in relation to athletes and what happens under stress. But what we have seen over time is that this process that happens, this intestinal permeability, can lead to autoimmune disease. It can lead to brain fog. It can lead to systemic inflammation, so like joint pain. And you'll also see a study coming up that is connecting how the gut and your joints relate. And so I'm going to explain this so that study makes sense. But essentially what happens is we have these different types of bacteria in the gut, and we also have these things called lipopolysaccharides. They essentially become endotoxins when they get into the bloodstream. So if you have this happening and you have leaky gut, and that this lining isn't as strong as we'd like it to be, these lipopolysaccharides can leak through as well as undigested food. And that's how you end up getting that's one of the ways you can get food sensitivities. But these lipopolysaccharides leak through and all these other things that aren't supposed to be getting into the bloodstream. And the only defense that your body has is to launch an immune response, right? So now we have, and this is where the source of inflammation, this isn't just the only source, but this is one of the reasons why if somebody's coming in and they say like, I have all these different types of things going on and it's a very inflamed body, we've got to look at the GI tract. So what happens is this triggers the immune system, and now we start to see all these different types of inflammatory markers start to pop up. One other study that's a very interesting one is that if you look at some of the studies where they test anti-anxiety meds and depression meds, they will sometimes, some studies will inject the guts of mice with lipopolysaccharides to cause inflammation and to cause leaky gut, and then they will administer their medication to see if it helps to reduce the anxiety or depression that pops up from that. So don't forget that the GI tract can lead to and can be very connected to other areas of the body, and that can be what's going on in the brain, the joints, and many other things as well. There are some other things that happen here too. I'm just going to mention really briefly, but there's part of your immune system. There's a big part of your immune system here. I mentioned the immune system here that's in the bloodstream, but there's also a piece of your immune system that's here, and that it's basically where these little finger outlets are, and it's called secretory IgA. It's your body's like first line defense. One of the things that can happen, especially for athletes that are kind of like pushing the limits, right? So they're doing a lot of high intensity exercise. This might be your people who are training for multiple hours a day, or this could be your athletes who are coming in and doing their swimming every week, but then they also have a lot of stress going on outside of their workouts. And so in their work-life balance, one of the things that can happen, especially if they're not eating enough protein and if they're not eating enough of different types of foods to keep the body happy, the body will essentially go to the gut. It'll pull protein from here because we don't store protein in very many places. It'll pull it from here, and it can cause more of that leaky gut to happen and also cause stress on that first line of defense as far as the immune system goes. So there's so much happening here that can translate into what you experience as far as pain, as far as your immune system, so being sick, and as far as injuries as well. Brain fog, focus, all sorts of stuff like that. The job of what I do though, is I want to make this look as clean and pretty as possible. One common question I get is like, well, I got a colonoscopy and they didn't say that I had holes in my gut. You are not going to see literal holes in your gut when you have intestinal permeability or leaky gut. These are on like a very microscopic scale. But what they might see on your colonoscopy is something that looks like inflammation or inflamed lining, like redness in the gut lining. That is a sign that things are that are not quite right. And that would be when you would want to look a little bit further and look a little bit deeper to see what's causing that and what's going on there so that you can get to the bottom of that. But what we want to see is really good microbiome diversity. We want to see low levels of pathogens and low levels of those endotoxins. We want to see strong tight junctions, low mucosa inflammation, so that your immune system can tackle what it needs to and not be bombarded all the time by a lot of stuff coming through your gut. And then I just put those into comparison. So, all right, this is a good one. I think, did I attach? Yeah, the studies here. So we'll go back. Okay, so the gut joint axis. This is a favorite of mine because a lot of athletes will get injuries and not realize that sometimes where that can come from, and also have joint pain, but sometimes where that can be coming from is the gut. So there's a few studies that have come out that looked at the inflammation that is going on in the gut and then how that can lead to injuries in your joints and to pain. So one of the things that happens is you have inflammation that comes from training, but that's usually stacked on top of maybe nutrient deficiencies, on top of traveling, on top of life stressors and medications like ibuprofen, which can increase leaky gut. That leads to, intestinal permeability, which can then lead to, remember what I was just talking about up there on those charts, so that lipopolysaccharide and that bacteria leak into the bloodstream. What happens is then your immune system is fighting that, and those endotoxins in that blood is circulating through your body, right? and that same blood is going to feed your joints, and that can lead to an increased risk for injuries. And what you experience as the athlete is usually joint pain, fatigue. It can be eventually injuries when the strain just gets too high, as well as mood changes. And there's studies that have looked at this, and I just put one in here that's a really, really good one. Okay. Oh, my screen's hiding that from me. Okay, so how can exercise affect your gut? We've been told that exercise is a really good thing, and it actually is a really good thing. We do need exercise, and what you'll see is the effect of different types of exercise, especially like I would say your standard kind of like 1 hour workout for the week per day. Like that's a really solid, that can have really positive impacts on the gut. But where this can start to fall apart is when we're looking at like our longer distance swims, our Ironmans, our endurance athletes, our endurance runners. If we're starting to kind of stack on a lot of the different stress and we're going for those longer events, that's what you're going to see pop up here. So, oh yes, and this is leading me into my next point. Okay, so what these studies looked at is how different types of how these endotoxin levels that popped up due to these longer distance events, and the effect of different types of probiotics and prebiotics as well as antioxidants, and how they affected these different types, these runners and these triathletes. And one of the things that was really interesting that they found was that they found these different changes that came up in the GI tracts of these different types of athletes, in particular with these lipopolysaccharides. There's a study that I attached here. Yeah, it's this one. Okay. So in one study, okay, this is just so interesting, and this is just one study that they listed here, but I've seen several now that have come out on this. But they looked kind of like overall at long distance triathletes, and they found that over a 16-hour event, there was a slight increase in those lipopolysaccharides. In contrast, they looked at, there was another study done on a group of ultra runners, and what they found, and this is of the group that required medical attention. So this isn't the whole group of people that participated, but of the ones who needed medical attention, what they found was an 81% of them in this ultra marathon had higher levels of LPS. And these levels were so high that they correlated with 80% had GI symptoms, but they correlated with these levels were so high that these are what we usually see in like autoimmune disease of the GI tract. And this was happening in our ultra runners. So what this study did then is they started to look at how can working with the GI tract help to reduce these things from happening. And GI stress is something that happens with a lot of people and a lot of athletes, especially in our endurance sports. These things look like bloating, they look like GI cramping. GI distress in and of itself can sometimes explain itself as far as what can happen when you are running for long distances. But these are symptoms though that can be very difficult for athletes, and they can actually pull them out of their race days if they don't fuel properly, if they go into the event with leaky gut, and then they go into this crazy day, and then that just perpetuates the problem. Because remember, we talked about some of those changes that can happen in the bacteria in the GI tract during those events. So these are all different types of things that they can experience, and these are studies that we're looking at what sort of changes can happen. And if these athletes went in with a gut that wasn't prepared for this, some of them ended up with a lot of issues, and maybe they didn't show up at that medical intent for, not all of them showed up at the medical intent for GI tract related things, but they may have been experiencing pain in other areas as well, and then that's why they showed up there. So super interesting studies. One of the things that they found was, and as I said, like that pro and prebiotic supplementation did seem to potentially help mitigate some of that intestinal permeability that happens, as well as, a possible antioxidant strategy. But we're going to talk about this in a little bit, because we don't necessarily want to put a ton of antioxidants in at certain times of the training cycle. And this is pretty critical when it comes to really seeing those performance gains when it comes to over supplementing. One more, because this is my favorite study. It's only a subject of one, so bear with me, please. It doesn't necessarily mean that it applies to all of the things, but this was a really interesting study because what they did was they ran a gut panel before and after this ultra marathon run, after this person did a race. And one of the things that they found was a bunch of changes with the GI tract. They actually saw this Firmicutes Bacteroidetes ratio that I talked about before. It jumped from 4 to, I think it says behind the pictures, like 14. Yeah, which is like an insane percentage change. And the point of this is that, again, there's just so many different things that are happening as we go into these really long endurance races, and this is swimming as well. I know they do this a lot on running, but as you like, there are so many changes that are happening with athletes as they are doing these events, and as they are training for a lot of these things, that there's a lot to learn. And it's important to note that there's a lot that you can do to set yourself up for success. And so, yeah, these are just really fun studies that I've loved to see. So following up on what I just said about those antioxidants and when is the right time to do some of these things. You've likely heard of the Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. Essentially what happens, you get a stressor from your training, right? So you go to swim and for an hour every morning. The reason why you see gains, the reason why you see your times increase, the reason why you see yourself do better is because when you have that stressor, so that workout, when you leave, your body goes, I'd rather not be unprepared for that again. So throughout the rest of the day, your body is recovering, your body's learning, your body's trying to overcome some of that inflammation that happened from that stressor, from that training, which is a really good thing. This is how we get stronger. So we get those adaptations to exercise. And then what we'll see often is a plateau. And then it's either we can either stay there and continue on, or we can end up kind of getting a little bit into that overtraining, overreaching side. And depending on what we choose to do, we can either push ourselves further that way, or we can turn things around and head back up to being able to see those gains again. Here's what's critical to understand in this scenario. When we are starting into a training block, what we want is to make sure that from like the GI tract perspective, from the nutrients perspective, micronutrients, all those things, we want to make sure that when you start out on these training blocks, you are like solid, you have everything that you need. Because the idea is that you do not want to put antioxidants into this phase. And this is not from food. We do want to be eating food and getting our antioxidants from food. This is from supplements. Here's what happens. There's lots of studies on this, but if you look at what happens when we put in supplemental vitamin C, an antioxidant, a very powerful antioxidant, it will delay your adaptation to exercise. So instead of it taking a day to get the benefits from your training, it might take you a week or a week and a half. I've even seen a study that it seemed to delay it by about 2 weeks. So we're not getting everything out of the training that we're doing if we're over supplementing. So the key here is, and this is, I'm going to say this in 2 caveats, okay? Because I know we probably have 2 different types of people on this call, but this is for somebody that is trying to really get those improvements so that they can achieve a goal of some type. It's usually like a race goal or something like that. The idea is when you start out on that 8 to 10 week training block, you stop your supplemental antioxidants. So this is where food is so important, and I cannot stress this enough, but making sure you're eating enough protein, enough fruits and vegetables, enough fat, getting lots of your different types of vitamins and minerals from food. That's very critical here, because the point is that you want to get the body to mop up that inflammation itself. Like you want to try and get the body to do it itself, which it does, right? I'm not, your body does this on a normal basis. This is what it does. But the idea is that you do not want to inhibit those adaptations by putting in supplements. Okay. So then what we're looking for is for you to get to this point where you start to plateau, and we see your body has basically led to an accommodation point where inflammation has reached such a point that at this rate, this is where we start to see things like maybe some niggles, some pains, some injuries, maybe some signs of a little bit of fatigue or exhaustion. At this point, that's where you want to put those antioxidants in. That's where we want to be, making some slight changes, maybe take a little bit of rest, allow the body to recover, and then send you right back in and up into those a new training block. And this is one of the ways that we can help prevent athletes from getting into an overtraining syndrome and leading to illnesses and injuries. But we need to be very critical, and we need to make sure that we are not over supplementing, because it can actually slow down those gains that you're trying to make, right? Okay, last bit on this though, because I know I'm going to get a question. For general health, a multivitamin and a multimineral, like your vitamin D, your omega-3s, even potentially a probiotic or a digestive enzyme, those are all fine for overall health. Okay, these are like your daily things. Like when I'm not headed into a training block, where like right now I'm training for a half Ironman in December, I'm literally in the middle of a training block. So I'm trying to avoid a lot of these different types of supplemental antioxidants, because I want to get the most out of my training, because that's what I'm trying to do. That's the goal. But when that's over, and in the in-between times, I will bring those back in to help mop up some stuff, clean up some stuff, and just get ready for the next goal in the next season of where I'm headed. So, but if you are not training for something specific and like swimming and the things, this is like just how you're staying healthy. A common multivitamin, a common multimineral, a fish oil, maybe a digestive enzyme, maybe a probiotic are going to be standard, like great things for you. Okay. Cool. This was just another study. This is just one of them, but there are many studies that looked at how vitamin C and vitamin E and those different types of antioxidants can impair adaptations to exercise. And so there's actually quite a few of them out there. Okay, so we're basically getting close to wrapping up here, but I did want to show you these because I do get a lot of questions of like, well, how do I know if something's wrong with my gut? I don't have symptoms. One of the things you can do is you can get testing to see what's actually going on in the gut. And what you can see are different types of bacteria that are in the gut. You can also see different inflammatory markers. Calprotectin is a big inflammatory marker that can be a sign of irritable bowel. It can also be a sign of the possibility of some autoimmune disease popping up. There are some very critical inflammatory markers here that really can give us an idea of what's going on with the GI tract. You can also look and see if you have enough digestive enzymes, if you're breaking down those meat fibers and those vegetable fibers so that you're actually getting the vitamins and minerals and amino acids that you want to be getting from your food. You can also see if you are passing fat through your stool, which can have some other different types of implications as far as what you're absorbing through your food. And you can also see how your immune system is functioning, as well as some other things as well. So there's many different ways that you can actually get a picture of what's going on with the gut. Okay, so a couple different things here that I just wanted to mention as far as what can you do before we wrap up. And I think I am right on time. A couple of different things of what we can do as far as like working with your GI tract so that you can at least leave today with some things that you can do. Number one, probiotics are helpful, but they're not great to use if you have leaky gut. So just if you aren't going to get a panel to see if you have intestinal permeability, if you have things that are going on like bloating, if you have some things that are going on with your immune system, if you have things like rashes on the skin that can sometimes be like psoriasis or things like that, if you have systemic joint pain, I encourage you to go out and see if you can run a panel that can show you what's going on in your gut. Otherwise, probiotics can be very helpful, but probiotics need to be supported with prebiotics. So here's what I would prefer you do. Let's look at food, okay? So really good source of protein, really good sources of vegetables and fruits and your whole grains, and really good sources of fat. So like avocados and your olive oils and things like that. Those are going to be great ways, and a wide diversity across the board. I'm talking about all sorts of different types of fruits, vegetables, and proteins and fats. The more diverse you can get with your diet, the better you can build up this GI tract bacteria over time. The other thing is that make sure you have some of those cultured and fermented foods there as well. So that looks like yogurts are a great source of bacteria in cultured foods, as well as like kefir is another one. Annatto, I think, is one. Yeah, or natto, sorry. natto is one. Miso is one, as well as sauerkraut, kimchi. Those are all different types of fermented foods that can help you as far as like bringing in more bacteria into your gut. Prebiotic foods are going to be things like onions. They're going to be things like garlic and bananas and plantains, lots of different Jerusalem artichokes, so sunchokes. Those are major prebiotics. Those are all really great ways for you to be able to feed the GI tract with and the bacteria that are there with just food. So the other thing too, really making sure you're getting enough sleep and drinking enough water. Those are also going to be really critical. And if you feel like your body is a little bit inflamed, sometimes incorporating things like turmeric and some of those anti-inflammatories can be helpful for reducing some inflammation. And if that helps, then that might be something that either could have just been going on in the body, but could also have been going on in the gut, and just things to look at, as well as making sure that you're getting good exercise too, keeping up with, and since I know this is to the swim, master swim team, keeping up with your swims, making sure you're showing up and doing those. Those are a really great way to be able to they have a good positive impact on your GI tract for sure. So if you have questions, or if you would like to learn more, I actually have a free series, video series, where you can go. It's at drkirsten.com/free, which you can grab there. It's basically a video series that I did to help answer some of the most common questions and help to at least be able to give you a different perspective on how to look at the body and things that are going on internally, because really what we want to do is not just think about the GI tract in and of itself, but how, and I hope that you saw this throughout this presentation, but how it can affect other systems in the body, and it's all connected. So we don't just want to work on one thing. We want to make sure that we're thinking about how it's affecting everything. You can also follow me on social media, but Instagram mostly if you're on there, at Dr. Kirsten. And then that's it. So I was right on time. What questions do you have? I'm so glad I'm right on time. I'm going to kick off of here so I can see what's going on with the chat, and we'll do that. How about that? Okay. Geneva asked, I hope I pronounced that right. How does fasting affect gut bacteria? Good, bad, situational. So fasting is actually really interesting for many reasons. Fasting can be really helpful for resetting hormones in the body. One thing that is we've known for a while is that if you can get 12 hours between dinner and breakfast, essentially like the last time you eat, that helps your liver be able to renew some of the hormones, some of the enzymes that it uses. It can also help with getting your mitochondria to reset. Fasting can help us promote building new types of mitochondria, which is a really good thing, especially if since we know that the mitochondria, I'm not going to get on too big of a rabbit hole here, but they're big energy producers in our body. So fasting can be really helpful there. It can have an impact on the GI tract, but the studies, more of what you want to make sure of, and I would say this from just an athlete perspective, is that you want to make sure if you are fasting that you're getting enough food in those eating hours. And this is something that I see more often, especially with athletes who are doing fasting, is that they will restrict those eating hours because they're trying to fast, right, for a certain number of hours, and they feel really good doing that. But then because they have less eating hours in the day, they don't get in as much calories and as much food to support not only their training, but also what they're doing in their, outside of their life and the stressors that are there as well. So just keep that in mind with fasting. Can be good. I don't think it's necessarily bad on the gut, but yeah, just things to keep in mind from an athlete perspective. Hopefully that answered your question. If you have follow-ups on that, let me know. Julie asked, how do you test for the ratios of bacteria in the gut? And she had to take off, so I'll just answer this, and maybe she'll catch it later on the recording. But how you test for different ratios is essentially, I showed you that at the end there with the different types of bacteria that are studied on these panels. So essentially what it is it's a stool panel that looks at everything that is in the gut. So these ratios, they basically look at this on a microscopic level, and they're looking at all of the different types of bacteria that are there. And then they create these maps out of that show us what's going on in the gut, which is really, really interesting. I love looking at GI panels. And the best part is when you see them improve, right? When you see those inflammatory markers get better, because you know that you're having an impact not only on how this athlete is going to perform, but you're also having an impact on how, like, longevity wise, as far as health goes, you're also impacting that too. Yeah, that works as well. You can also email Tim too. How long typically does it take to heal leaky gut from Barb? Okay, this is something, this is also a really good one. Okay. So one of the ways that leaky gut can start, and I'm going to use gluten as a explanation here. So whenever anybody gets exposed to gluten, it can produce some leaky gut, because what happens is gluten comes in, and gluten is the protein in wheat. Okay, so gluten comes into the GI tract. It gets the GI tract lining; those cells get exposed to that gluten. They produce something called zonulin, which is inflammatory, and then that is then what ends up starting to create some of this leaky gut in between those tight junctions. Like, these cells are not supposed to let anything between there, but then they start to get a little bit leaky. So for most people, they don't have a problem with gluten. So this heals up within maybe an hour or two max. I mean, it's usually a very quick turnaround. But for other people, this can sometimes, from one exposure, this can take up to a few days. It can take up to a few weeks. It can take up to 6 months. And for some, it can take up to a year. To just heal from leaky gut from one exposure to gluten. So now, if you then consider that with also some of these leaky gut changes that can happen with these ultra endurance events, if you are not putting in some of the things that help to reduce inflammation and help to heal up that gut lining, and we just allow that inflammation to just perpetuate, people can be dealing with these types of situations for a really long time. So for some, it's a short answer and it's one day. For others, it can be a while. So if you're treating it, though, it just depends on the patient, honestly, and on the athlete. And sometimes it's a fast thing, and sometimes it takes us a few months to really rework a lot of what's going on here. Okay, those were all the questions in the chat. Does anybody else have any more questions? You can unmute yourself and pop in.
I have a quick question for you, Dr. K.
Yeah. Yeah.
I heard that your dental hygiene and the health of your mouth cavities and things like that directly affect your gut as well. That can lead to different diseases and ailments.
Yeah, one of the cool things about dentists is that they've done a really good job at trying to teach people how different types of bacteria can interact with our body. So a lot of the times what you'll hear is, like, with periodontal disease, you'll hear that can actually be a direct correlation with the, getting cardiovascular disease and some other things down the line, right? So, and that is in many ways what's going on with the oral microbiome, so the bacteria that are in your mouth. And flossing and keeping up with some of those things are really beneficial for keeping that bacteria in a really nice and good balance. But also on top of that, the bacteria that are there can also end up right in the stomach and then into the GI tract as well. So kind of going back to what I was talking about as far as like getting outside, getting into the soil, I think I'm not going to get on too much of a tangent here, but I think sometimes we've lost a little bit of the other layers of cooking and eating food, like we don't necessarily grow our own food anymore, so we don't necessarily go out. And some people garden, I garden, but not everybody does. And so you don't get that same, like when I go out and pick veggies, I never leave with clean hands, right? Like I've always got soil, like there's dirt on my hands. I never leave the garden without some dirt on my hands. And I think that in and of itself is just one area where we've sort of lost this connection with, like, from start to finish, when you grow food to then when it ends up in your mouth and like as you're eating it, there's so many different areas where we get exposed to all these different types of bacteria and all these different types of things, and we've lost a lot of that connection. So yes, there's so much more too that we're learning. And I love going to my dentist because we like nerd out over all of these things. And I learn what they're learning so that I could, learn more on my side as well. But the oral microbiome, your skin microbiome, all of these different things have an impact on everything, that's going on in the body, not just the gut. So yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah. Let's see, Joy. Yes, Joy.
How about the high fructose corn syrup that's in everything, like yogurt and things like that?
Oh.
How do you get away from all that stuff?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So high fructose corn syrup is basically just really processed sugar, and it's a nasty business for the body in general. What I do for patients, especially when I'm talking about things like kombuchas and yogurts, and things like that, the idea is to look at, actually, here's a trick. The idea is to look for the plain yogurts. Okay, so plain Jane yogurts, because they're not going to have any added sugar to them. And then what you do is you can add a little bit of honey, maybe some blueberries or some raspberries, so that sweetens it up a little bit. And also what I would suggest, especially if you're doing this for breakfast, make sure you have like some eggs or some other type of protein source. Maybe if you are vegan, vegetarian, maybe some tofu, something like that. So you get not only a little bit of the sugar that comes from like the fruit or the honey, but you also get it balanced out with that protein, which is pretty critical.
Okay.
But if you put that honey in there, honey is a really good prebiotic. So now you've got a lot of, that bacteria coming in from the yogurt, but you also have that prebiotic coming in from the honey. And then you can get away from that a little bit as far as like those higher sugars that come from those. The other trick I usually say as well is try to, if you're like looking for kombuchas and things like that, the lower the sugar, the better. So like, 9 grams is even high, but like 9 grams or less. So if you can find the ones that are like 4 or 5 grams of sugar, and not having those all the time, but like one a week of a kombucha that's like that is a really great way to like get just a different type of bacteria into the body without exposing yourself to too much sugar.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. That's a good question. Sugar's hard on the body. And yeah,
it's in everything.
It is. I know. Well,
Sucrose,
I know.
Fructose, corn syrup.
I know.
You never see anything that just says like honey.
Yes.
And it's like 36% sugar.
Yes.
It's just frustrating to go and have to stand there and look at everything and what's in it and stuff.
Yes.
It just drives me nuts trying to figure out what to eat.
Oh, I get it. I do. What I love to stick by is like the majority of the time trying to stay to those outer rims of the grocery store. So, your vegetables, your fruits, your grains, your proteins, those all tend to be sort of towards the outsides of the supermarket-ish. And then I go into the middle for the little things, here and there. But I don't want to take up too much more time, but one of the things that happened when grocery stores started coming in after World War II is they found that foods went rancid really easily.
Yeah.
So what they
all this stuff in it to preserve them.
So what they had to do was they took the fats out. So they took like your good fats, your like omega-3s and things like that. They took those out. And then they ended up putting in like omega-6s, so those omega-6 fats that are a little bit more shelf stable. And then they also kind of went the direction of the low fat, right, and put sugar in to replace it so that you could actually eat it. So a lot of those products that sit on the shelves that have like long shelf life, those are the ones that are the trickiest, because they do have quite an impact on how the body responds to them. But I am not here to tell people to restrict eating in any ways. I prefer to take the perspective of focus on the things that you can add to your diet, to what you eat, that help to contribute to how you feel, which should be good when you eat foods like vegetables and fruits and proteins and whole grains. Like those types of foods should make you feel good. And so if you focus on those and you try to keep your focus on like filling up the most of your day with those things, then where the little things come in, then it doesn't have as much of a long-term impact as, when it's making up the majority of what you eat. And that's how I prefer to look at things, because life is life, and I don't really love to look at like good food or bad food. I just like you to kind of take into mind what makes me feel good. Right. And then that's well, yeah, ultimately what in the long run, what makes me feel good, because sometimes eating sugar makes you feel good, but maybe not for the long term. Right.
No.
So, yeah. And just, understanding too, that like a lot of what we eat does impact, the gut bacteria. It impacts a lot of those things that can then contribute to our health, either good or bad, on either side. So
Does
trying to
just plain old acidophilus, is
Yeah.
that good for you? Because I take that.
Yeah, acidophilus.
gut.
Yep. I think that's what a lot of kefir is made out of, is that, but also like apple cider vinegars, all of those different types of things have bacteria in them. So yeah, you're getting a lot of different kind of stuff from that.
Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you
you
so
got it.
much.
Oh, you're
I
welcome.
love listening to you. You're so
Oh.
interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate you being here. It's nice to see people on the call.
Yeah,
I love to
told
talk
Tim-
about it.
Yeah, I told Tim to get you back on.
Oh,
So
thanks.
come back again.
Okay, I will. It won't take much to convince me.
Oh, good.
Awesome. All right. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Don't see any at this time.
Cool.
I wanted to give a big shout out to Molly Grover over in Maryland Masters for joining us tonight.
Yay.
From the East Coast. So welcome.
Thank you.
Terrapin Masters on Potomac
Terrapin.
Valley, not Maryland.
Oh.
Details.
Complicated on the East Coast.
Glad to
Well,
have
and
you.
it's late for you too, so thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Cool.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Okay.